All right, so now we're going to look a little bit more deeply into the Theaetetus dialogue. We're now at 155C8 to about 157C1. We're dealing with, yes, the flux theory of perception and reality too. So this is Socrates now examining this first proposal. Remember, what is knowledge, right? Socrates asked that question, and Theaetetus gave him an answer, gave him the definitions thing. Socrates says, nah, that's no good. And then Theaetetus thought about it a little more, and he said, let's go with knowledge is perception, or episteme is aesthesis in the original Greek. So, this discussion here of the flux theory of perception in more depth and ties it into metaphysics as well. So we go from epistemology, theory of knowledge, to ontology, metaphysics, theory of what reality is. And we have just come off the discussion, the preliminary discussion, shall we say, of this flux theory, where Socrates has talked about, is there any evidence for this? You know, can we motivate a position, this flux position? And remember, this flux position is a combination of Protagoras, the homo mensura thesis, sliding into this all is flux position as articulated by Heraclitus. So this is Protagoras, Heraclitus, all rolled up. We've looked at some preliminary, is there a little bit of evidence for this? Talked about motion and things like that. Yeah, there seems to be some evidence. So we've had a preliminary discussion, and some puzzles came out of that. And Socrates says, well, what do you think, Theaetetus? How does this look? And Theaetetus says something kind of odd, but it's an important point nonetheless. Theaetetus says, thinking about all these puzzles and all these curiosities makes me, Socrates, feel a little lightheaded or a little giddy, as some translators like to put it. Well, Socrates says that that's actually an important point. Namely, that true philosophy begins in this kind of giddiness. And why would that be important? Well, think of it this way. If you're a little bit giddy about it, if you're a little bit lightheaded, if you're a little bit unsure, if you're a little bit unaware or at least aware of the fact that you're not sure, that's the mind's preparation for doing philosophy. That's when you start saying, I don't really know, I'm going to truly investigate. You lift or suspend all your beliefs for a tiny bit, maybe for a while, at least while you pursue the investigation. Socrates will be regarded as a skeptic in many ways by some of the thinkers in the Greek tradition long after Socrates has passed on. And the reason being is that Socrates does say, look, if you want to discover new things, you're going to have to at least suspend your belief or at least loosen it a bit. Become a little giddy. And hence, philosophy begins in giddiness, or philosophy begins in wonder. Right? And this, think about wonder, it's not just puzzlement or confusion, but it's where you think you're willing to accept that perhaps what you thought is wrong. Or maybe it's not perfectly true. Or you might suspect it's still true, but you're not sure how to prove it. All right, so loosening up, lightening up a bit, and off we go to do some philosophy. So in this flux thesis, we're going to come into the view that all of reality is composed essentially of kinesis, right? And kinesis is often translated as motion. That's where we get our term like kinetic energy, energy of motion. So kinesis. Reality is ultimately composed of kinesis or motions. And Socrates says, we have to, in order to understand this theory, my Theaetetus, notice that the people around us are not really paying attention, because those are people that think that everything is what you can simply see. We have to dig a bit deeper and go beyond some of our regular presuppositions. And we'll see what that means in a minute. But at least it's going beyond thinking that everything that is real is that which you can simply grasp with your hands. Well, that again is a lightening up of the attitude, an opening up to other possibilities. All right, so we've had a little bit of evidence. Time to dig in a little bit deeper. So you look around the world, what do you see? You do see a lot of this kinesis, a lot of motion. So let's look at that. Without presupposing what's behind it and all that, what do you think about this? Well, the main principle that underpins the flux thesis and this whole approach is that that is exactly what there is in the world. There's just motion, nothing else. All the other things that we talk about, namely things like, you know, pens and pencils, pyramids and soup spoons and horses and all these things, those shouldn't be thought of as things underneath the motions. So this gets a bit tricky to think about. So let's go through this. So the main principle that underlies this is that everything is in motion. So take that with a little grain of salt here. So we'll put scare quotes on it. Everything is in motion, and there is nothing but motion. That's all there is in the world. There's just motions. It's sometimes regarded as an early version of what's called process philosophy. Process philosophy. And what's interesting, again, if you look at a lot of modern physics, a lot of modern atomic physics, the notion of self-same, stable things like atoms as billiard balls banging around and bouncing around little solar systems and all those models, those are fine to start your understanding of modern science. But in the end, a lot of those things have gone by the wayside and in favor of things like processes. So this view that reality is ultimately made of processes is around us today, certainly in a much more sophisticated form, but nonetheless, it still is around. So let's get a little bit deeper. Socrates says that motion, according to this, now this isn't necessarily what Socrates believes. Remember, he's just articulating a position here. And he says, look, everything is in motion according to this theory of kinesis, this flux theory. Motion is composed of two infinite forms, all right? And the infinite forms, sometimes powers, ancients talked a lot about powers, and for our purposes here, we'll just stick with the forms, or we might slide back and forth. Don't worry too much about that. But there's two kinds of forms. There's active and passive. And these two forms, as they move about, as these kinds of motions move about, they intertwine, they combine in various ways. So you have various combinations, but according to the theory, they're always producing, in their combinations, they produce offspring, as Socrates says, but always in the form of twins. So an active and a passive will produce an offspring, but the offspring are twins. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's look at a little bit of an example. Here's a chart. Here's a simplified version and then a little bit more complex version. So just two charts and we have a good idea of what Socrates is talking about, and then we'll look at an example. Okay, so once again, you got your two forms, active, passive, and they come in combinations. So you have, for example, a combination that produces a twin would be one side is the perception and one side is the perceived. Now there's a ton of scholarship and tons of ink spilled over how to interpret this. I'm going to give you a fairly simple and I think relatively orthodox interpretation of what's going on here. But don't be fooled. Many scholars have written books on this stuff. The Theaetetus, as I've said many times, is a heavily studied dialogue. It's a very complex one. But let's see if we can just dig in so that we can understand the basics. And then, you know, if you like, you can go off and dig deeper in the literature. It's quite fascinating how people have different interpretations. But here goes with a fairly straightforward one. So we got our combinations in twins. Generally, you get this kind of structure. You get a perception like an act, the perception. So you could think of like the perceiving, the act of perceiving. And what would that be? Well, aesthesis, remember, it's sort of this impression, this deep impression that's immediate to you, like seeing, you know, like the basic senses, seeing, smelling, tasting, touch, etc., 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 etc. So the act of seeing, well, what do you see? You see a color. Now notice that seeing is correlated with colors, smelling with smells, and tasting with taste. You might think, well, so what? But it's an important point. It'll come up a little bit later in the dialogue. Aristotle will react to it as well a little bit in some of his work, but that there are these nice, neat correlations between acts of seeing. They're always correlated with colors. So the eye cannot smell anything. The ear cannot taste anything. That is that your particular senses have their own proper correlated objects. So you have active seeing, colors, and smelling, and so you have this nice little chart. Socrates says, okay, do you get it? Do you understand, Theaetetus, what this is all about? Theaetetus says, no, I don't quite get it. Socrates says, okay, I'm going to go one step further, go a little deeper into this. So in addition now to there being two infinite forms that are differentiated according to powers, active and passive, we notice something else about motion. Simple. Remember, the Greeks, their theories were all based on simple observation. They didn't have high-powered scientific apparatus to make all kinds of measurements and things like that. They just used their regular senses. Well, some motions are slow and some are fast. Some are active, some are passive. Motion of being a passive motion, remember, is something like you change as you learn things. So I would hope that my active motion of giving you information, of passing out information, that would be an active motion. Your passive motion would be receiving the information and being moved by it, right? We often use that in an emotional sense. I was very moved by that performance, right? As in it changed my emotions. It changed me. It made me move in a direction of towards happiness or sadness, depending if you're watching comedies, tragedies, or some combination thereof. But a passive movement is you are being changed by this active movement of me doing this teaching, hopefully. All right, but it can either go fast or slow. So in addition to active-passive, we have fast and slow. That makes for a slightly more complex chart. Instead of just these two, you have four, so they can combine in different ways. So I made up a little chart here. We still have our power or our form, active and passive. Okay, so those guys are still there. But we also have, shall we say, a speed, fast and slow. So instead of having just two things of the perception and the perceived in this simple chart, we have a little bit more going on. We have active fast, active slow, passive fast, passive slow. Now, with all these details, Socrates embarks on trying to apply this theory. So there you go. There's our theory in shall we say, a kind of formalized sense. Now the question is, can we apply this? Again, lots of ink spilled over how you can apply this. I'll give you just a straightforward, shall we say, simplified version of Socrates' discussion, trying not to be too controversial here. So Socrates gives us an example of an application of this theory. And why are we doing all this? Because we are still exploring knowledge is perception. Episteme aesthesis. So don't lose sight of what's going on. That doesn't mean Socrates is going to agree with this theory. This is an excellent chance for you to see a philosopher in action. Is this a good theory? Let's look at it in detail, in real patient detail, so we understand it before we either accept or reject it. All right. So we got our information here in this little chart. Socrates says, let's apply it to an example of vision. More specifically, an interaction between an eye and a stick. So this is how we would, this is ordinary. This is sort of an ordinary thing that we would want to be able to ask, well, what's going on really when we talk about an interaction between an eye and a stick? Now, notice, we've got two things. Remember, we're ultimately talking about processes. So an eye and a stick. So to get your head sort of into the space of this kind of thinking, try and not think of objects and things as stable. Think of them as a process. So take something that you would normally think of as, a real stable thing, like a pyramid, like the pyramids at Giza, right? But remember, there was a time when they weren't there. There was a time when they were designed. Then they were built. And as they were being built, they weren't the pyramids. Then they came and they were built, and then people started calling them, oh, it's the pyramids. But the minute they're supposedly built, what happens? Well, they're interacting with the environment. There's a little bit of weathering, right? Certainly the wind is hitting them right away, and the sand's blasting them, stuff like that. A little bit of erosion. People start stealing stuff from them, right? We know that people took a lot of the marble facing from those pyramids. They used to be quite beautiful and covered with marble, and people took that stuff. They're not to be thought of as just things. They're active. They're interacting with the environment, almost like you think of like an organism, right? It starts off, it has a process, like a caterpillar goes through all this process, it becomes a butterfly, and it lives its life, and it dies. So there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, like a story. So try to think of things like that. So instead of thinking of the eye as a thing, think of the eye as a process. A slow process. The Egyptian pyramid would be a process, but it's like a super duper slow process. The sun is a process, right? Because it's had a beginning, it was born, and then it's burning its fuel reserves, and eventually it will die. It too is a process, but it's a slow process. So think about things as slow processes. If you could film a pyramid over thousands and thousands of years, then speed it up, you'd see it would look much more like a process. So the eye is a very slow, and remember, there's not only speeds, there's power. So the eye is a passive process. It doesn't really do anything. Ancients had odd theories of vision, but we can put that to the side. But in general, think of it as a passive process. It receives. So it's a slow and passive process. Other objects that have effects on things, as I said, my teaching is supposed to be an active process, have an effect on you. Think of like a stick as a slow process, right? That gives it stability. But it's active. It can affect things, right? You can use a stick to do something with, push something or hit something or whatever. Or in this sense, cause vision or have a role in vision. So you have two slow processes, one passive, one active. They blend, and then you get a result. And what's the result? There is a perceiving and a percept. The perceiving and the percept, these are faster, right? Because, when you notice, you see, you have different things coming in and things are changing. And what you're seeing is changing as well. So the whole idea of the eye and the stick, these are slow processes that as they combine, they give rise to different speeds. In this case, they're both fast. And you have the active perception and that which is perceived. Now, what we've got is a kind of story. We've got basically an explanation as to why we would think, and some of these are just, you name a slow process, we tend to call those things. But they're actually not things, right? In that self-stable sense. They're just a slow process. Again, go back to the pyramid. There was a time when it was coming into existence, and the minute it's sort of coming in, it's passing out because it's starting to decay. Organisms, same thing. There's only really change. And basically, think of it this way. If this, shall we say, this whole system, this active power, passive power, fast and slow, if this really explains all of reality, then we've made a fundamental mistake by saying that the word exists really applies to anything. We should think about abolishing the verb to be and only think in terms of becoming. Because that's all there really is. There's just flux. There's no complete stable thing of any kind. Everything is just in flux. The only thing you'd have, maybe some of you have picked up on this, is maybe this categorization is the stable thing. That's what's stable over time. You don't have, you don't have new kinds, active, passive, and then a third form. These are just a couple of binaries that would describe it. And that was also common in ancient philosophy too. They were binaries to describe things. So you have an active, a passive, a fast, and the slow. You have this categorization. That's the only stability there is. Everything else that we talk about, all our experience, like you, me, all the stuff we're doing, that's just completely motion. That's all, again, kinesis. Now, everything is motion. Everything is process. Keep in mind, though, that this is going to be rejected. And so that's our important point in this. But we've got a clear idea of what Socrates thinks that the ascription of perception or aesthesis to knowledge, where it leads. It leads you to this view of perception and this view of reality, this whole flux thesis. You went from Protagoras down into Heraclitus, and you end up with this metaphysics of flux. So then, after all this, Socrates says, okay, Theaetetus, what do you think? What do you think about this? Does this look okay? Do you agree with all this? And Theaetetus says, well, yeah, this looks pretty good. Right? Most people tend to be somewhat convinced by Socrates when he gets rolling here. And Socrates says, you know, in the end, I'm not offering this as my theory. I'm just offering this as a theory that follows from your initial ascription of knowledge is aesthesis or perception. And so Theaetetus says, yeah, I think I like this theory. This looks good. So Socrates says, all right, well, is this flux theory just a wind egg? Remember, Socrates, to go back to the midwife example, did you finally, it thinks that maybe we've given birth, you know, you've given birth, I've helped you as your intellectual midwife. Is this flux theory just a wind egg? We got to examine it a little bit more. And Theaetetus says, okay, let's have a look at it a little bit deeper, but what are we missing? Well, there's one kind of experience that seems to be missing. Remember, this is all tied together with our homo mensura thesis that perceptions are true, right? So true for me, my aesthesis, my perceptions are true for me, yours are true for you. Well, it seems that this theory says that this will work fairly well for our ordinary experiences, like in the world of sticks and you know, eyes and sticks and all that. But Socrates is going to raise an interesting example that might show that this theory has a deep problem. And that one we will see in the next video. Stay tuned.